Florida's Governor Ron Desantis has officially gotten critical race theory banned in their schools. It will also ban teachings from the 1619 Project, which is fake news and historical revisionism. Now, of course, the far left and the woke are particularly mad about this. They are pushing the lie that critical race theory is just an analysis of where race and law intersect. Now, of course, no matter what definition you try to give them as to what critical race theory is, they'll always kind of tweak it or change it. We need to understand what is actually being banned because Ron DeSantis did not overtly say critical race theory, but everyone kind of understands that's what's banned. Specific tenets of critical race theory have been banned in Florida, and not just in Florida. Many other states and jurisdictions are seeking to ban the overtly anti-American and racist ideology. I'll give you a simple definition of critical race theory. Now, what the left means when they say this, they mean academic research analyzing where the law and race intersect. It is a component, a racial component, of what's called critical theory, which is essentially, well, I want to be very careful of the definition of critical theory, but it is Marxist. It is cultural Marxism. It is from the Frankfurt School, and in many ways seeks to analyze the structures of power and law in government and in societies, but it is overwhelmingly Marxist. Now, critical race theorists are actually something quite insidious, in my opinion. They are reactionaries. If I were to give you an actual breakdown in layman's terms, what critical race theory is, I would describe it as critical race theory is a reactionary ideology masquerading as academic theory, which seeks to reverse the civil rights movement. It is a racial component of critical theory, which also seeks to subvert power structures in governmental institutions. Critical race theorists want to bring back racial segregation. Don't take my word for it. I'll show you their quotes. They advocate for overt racial discrimination. What you need to understand about critical race theory and history is that the rule of law in the world for tens of thousands of years of human history has been what's called identitarianism. A simple way to break down that, I know there's a lot of jargon here, is that when the United States was formed, it was overtly a white nation. But things changed. There was a revolution of ideas put forth through classical liberalism from great thinkers like John Locke, as well as many of the founding fathers, basically all of the founding fathers. And we determined that individualism is, well, it trumps all, essentially. There still is a responsibility to the collective, but we must protect the individual. Now, the founding fathers and many of these thinkers were overtly racist, and that's what critical race theory uses to manipulate people. Well, instead of getting ahead of myself, how about I show you the news as to what's actually going on, and then we'll break down the core analysis. For the past 56 years, we have had a revolution. Identitarianism is out. The 1964 Civil Rights Act says you cannot discriminate on the basis of race. For the first time in human history, we now have a government that says people must be treated fairly regardless of their identity. Now, of course, there are still people who push back on identitarianism and identitarianist policies, and I believe overtly that we should not be basing the law on identity. We should be restricting that. Of course, it's not a one-for-one argument. There are certainly some conservatives who don't think some identities should be protected, and some conservatives who think some identities should be protected. It is a long, complicated process, but ultimately what I'm trying to say is reactionaries. That's what the critical race theorists are. A reactionary is someone who wants to revert to the status quo, to a previous political period they thought was better. That is critical race theory. They do not like that we ended segregation, and they want racial discrimination. They want to revert us to how it was before civil rights. There's some nuance to that statement, so let me break it down. But first, I'll bring you the news. Before we get started, head over to timcast.com, become a member to get access to exclusive members-only segments from the Timcast IRL podcast. But when you become a member, your membership dues, what you pay, is helping us to expand this business. We're hiring journalists. We're expanding the newsroom. We are going to be fact-checking the fact-checkers and fact-checking across the board. We are going to do our best to create real news, new shows, culture, commentary, podcasts, sitcoms, even to build culture, to prove that we're for something. And here's what we like. Good old entertainment without the wokeness, anti-wokeness, and real news. Become a member to help support that effort. But don't forget to like this video, subscribe to this channel, share this video. I'm going to give you a breakdown and an assessment of critical race theory. And I'm also going to stress we must not get wrapped up in the simplistic idea of critical race theory in terms of what the culture war really is. If you know people who don't understand what critical race theory is or have a tribalist view of it, allow me to break things down and show you the latest news. And I will tell you this. I think the conservatives have some things wrong. I think the liberals and the leftists have a lot wrong. And I'm going to try and break this down to explain what's happening and why. Here's a story from Fox News. Florida Board of Education approves DeSantis' rule banning critical race theory. The rule doesn't explicitly mention critical race theory, but aims to combat associated ideas. Now, of course, I know many people may say Fox News is biased, so I'll also show you CNN. Florida bans teaching critical race theory in schools. They say Florida has become the latest state to ban critical race theory, continuing the growing charge by Republican lawmakers against schools teaching about systemic racism. Full stop. One thing we've often seen from the left is that they will assert critical race theory is just teaching about systemic racism. That is only partially true. It is actually fairly untrue, but there's a morsel of truth to it. The problem is critical race theorists, the woke, what they do is they feign academia. They pretend this is an academic theory, and they take a morsel of truth and then use that to push overtly reactionary racist ideologies. Well, if you oppose racism and you believe in civil rights for all people, then you must understand what critical race theory is and how they are manipulating you. That's right. White supremacists and racists are trying to manipulate your goodwill and your opposition to bigotry in order to push these laws. It's a brilliant semantic argument on the point of the reactionaries, but we must call it out for what it is. CNN says, after hours of debate and public comment Thursday, the Florida State Board of Education unanimously approved the amendment banning critical race theory. Florida Governor Ron Desantis, who appointed much of the board, spoke ahead of the meeting, saying critical race theory would teach children the country is rotten and that our institutions are illegitimate. That is not worth any taxpayer dollars, he said. The amendment states topics must be factual and objective, and specifically prohibits the teaching of critical race theory, meaning the theory that racism is not merely the product of prejudice, but that racism is embedded in American society and its legal systems in order to uphold the supremacy of white persons. Now, that is a simplistic view, and often it is the definition used to obfuscate what they're actually trying to do. Take a look at almost any country on the planet, and their laws are rooted in their ethno-nationalism or identitarianism. Identitarianism, simply put, I know it's hard to get to the jargon. Identity plus government, identitarian. So if you had like libertarian, you're saying liberty-based government or structures. Authoritarian is authority-based. Identitarian is policy and law based on identity. We get rid of that. Now, of course, there are remnants of it. What's true is systemic racism exists, but the founding fathers laid forth a new nation which created core tenets which ultimately abolished these things for the first time in human history. For the first time. Of course, other nations, Europe particularly, also got rid of many of these things. It is relatively new that we have gotten rid of race-based law. These people want to bring it back. I oppose that. And I'll explain, because I know the leftists try to nitpick. What I mean is negative and positive rights, discrimination towards a negative, putting people down instead of helping people up. There's a lot to understand here, but let's read more. They say, the amendment also bans materials from the 1619 Project, a Pulitzer Prize-winning initiative by the New York Times that reframed American history around the date of August 1619, when the first slave ship arrived on America's shores. The 1619 Project, if you're not familiar, is a work of fiction. And I don't mean that as a derogatory opinion. I mean, quite literally, it is a work of fiction. They take a look at American history and they made things up. And they even admitted they made things up and even said, the people who wrote this, that it was not intended to be a historical view. Unfortunately, many schools are teaching this overt fiction. Let's read more. In a statement posted to Twitter, DeSantis said the amendment protects students from being indoctrinated to think a certain way, mirroring language used by other states and locales that have made similar moves. Critical race theory teaches kids to hate our country and to hate each other. It is a state-sanctioned racism and has no place in Florida schools. In fact, this is true. There have been many. I should stress something very, very important. Many people can't define critical race theory very well, and that's probably on purpose. The left does not give good ground to people in order to challenge their ideas. We first learned of it as maybe intersectionalism, feminism, intersectionality, third wave, fourth wave feminism, and now ultimately critical theory. The words keep changing. This is a pit trap for conservatives who have started focusing on critical race theory instead of wokeness. Call it wokeness. Now, I've heard people say, I don't want to use that because it's a pejorative. Critical race theory is one component of critical theory. It is a passive element of the woke who also adhere to things like intersectionality. It is complicated on purpose. It seeks to exploit your goodwill to seize power from the working class, empower the elites, and empower overt white supremacists. For example, Robin DiAngelo is an author, a critical race theorist, she is an admitted white supremacist who's expressed in her book her discomfort being around black people. Do not go to these white supremacists for your views. I'll break this down for you. I'm trying to explain this so that you can share this video with people who don't understand it. Many of them won't believe it, but you need to understand that the critical race theorists are seeking to manipulate and lie. I will tell you this. For what it's worth, and I know it's memed, I am second generation mixed race from a mixed race family who fought for civil rights and experienced the horrors of racial segregationism. I do not wish this to return. Now, the critical race theorists and the woke will try and claim that anyone who opposes them are the actual racists. Do not believe them. I will show you quotes from these people so you understand. They go on to say, let me read a little bit more so you can hear some of the counter arguments. Critical race theory has become politicized in recent months, with opponents arguing the area of study is based on Marxism. It's not about an argument. I will prove to you it is. And is a threat to the American way of life. But critical race theory, according to scholars who study it, explores the way in which a history of inequality and racism in the United States has continued to impact American society today. Quote, it's an approach to grappling with a history of white supremacy that rejects the belief that what's in the past is in the past and that the laws and systems that grow from the past are detached from it. Kimberly Crenshaw, a founding critical race theorist and a law professor at UCLA and Columbia University, told CNN last year. And yet, across the country, local boards of education and states are pushing against teaching the impact of systemic racism and critical race theory in schools, calling it indoctrination. CNN, of course, believes in this ideology. CNN, of course, is biased. In fact, I can show you up here, ground.news shows you CNN's bias is left bias. Now, they're right in many of these regards, though. Cobb County bans critical race theory in its classrooms. We also have this from dispatch.com. House Republicans introduce bill to ban teaching of critical race theory in Ohio. We can see the manifestations of critical race theory, and I'll break down for you how the media plays this and how to avoid the lies. First, media giant iHeart. We are looking at only diverse hires at this time. Opponents of critical race theory tend to support the ideas of meritocracy, that people earn their positions through hard work and proving their value. Of course, a company that focuses on meritocracy will likely succeed, as the best candidate for the position will take that position. Now, critical race theorists do make a good point when they say that historical racism and the remnants of systemic racism create a disadvantage for minorities. Ultimately, however, these disadvantages manifest among class and not among race when we've already banned racial discrimination. While it may be true that there is a disproportionate amount of black families and Latino families who will suffer the remnants of historical racism, redlining and blockbusting, for example, at this point, we have already in law banned these practices. At this point, we must focus on class. And if it is true, so the critical race theorists say, that black families are disproportionately held back by these policies, then class-based solutions will disproportionately benefit these same black families. Of course, critical race theorists don't accept that because their true goal is not to help minorities. In fact, it is likely to cause them harm by reversing civil rights policy. For example, California has a constitutional amendment banning discrimination on the basis of race in public accommodations, universities, and contracting. The Democrats in that state attempted to repeal that amendment, which only would have benefited the overwhelmingly white majority. Of course, critical race theorists say other states don't have that policy, so why does it matter? And I say, I think it's good that we ban discrimination on the basis of race. Now, let me show you how it's framed in the left. They say, The Nation, Florida's Ron Desantis wants to cancel education about systemic racism. An authoritarian governor and 2024 GOP presidential prospect seeks to bar teaching how slavery, segregation, and white supremacy have shaped policy. That's not true at all. It is a gross mischaracterization of what they're seeking to ban. Now, critical race theory in itself may be academic ideas and theories, but its manifestation, as I just pointed out, is typically what conservatives and the anti-woke and anti-identitarians are protesting against. I don't oppose teaching people about critical race theory. I oppose the indoctrination of critical race theory ideology. Let me explain. I actually think it's fairly important that people know what critical race theory is and are taught why people think the things they do. I think schools can teach what critical race theory is without indoctrinating kids to its ideas as if they are true. We can teach children, this is Islam. This is what Islam believes, without telling them Islam is true and correct. You see my point? The Nation says, Ron DeSantis is an authoritarian trying to ban the teaching of slavery. Yeah. We hear this on the left. That's not true. Let me show you what Wikipedia says critical race theory is. They say critical race theory is an academic movement of civil rights scholars and activists in the United States who seek to critically examine the law as it intersects with issues of race and challenge mainstream liberal approaches to racial justice. Critical race theory examines social, cultural, and legal issues as they relate to race and racism. They go on to mention several prominent critical race theorists like Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, Cheryl Harris, et cetera, et cetera. You get the point. I would like to show you some of the things that are heavily criticized. In their views section, there are common themes. One of the things they mention is white privilege, which is heavily criticized. The idea of white privilege it stems from the notion of whiteness as property, whereby whiteness is the ultimate property that whites alone can possess. The problem with this is that critical race theory, at its best, is heavily restricted to just Europe, European countries, and the United States. And it doesn't account for the laws that have been passed, and it doesn't account for the civil rights movement. You can argue that white privilege exists. The problem is it's a surface level view. The reality is that the world is overwhelmingly identitarian. China overwhelmingly benefits the Chinese. Japan, policy-wise, overwhelmingly benefits the Japanese. In South Korea, for example, their laws overwhelmingly benefit South Koreans. And these are usually defined by ethnicity. In the United States, it's a very different structure. We are the great American melting pot. So you have a majority privilege for sure, and remnants of historical racism and systemic racism like redlining and blockbusting, policies that made it very difficult for black families to move into wealthier neighborhoods and accrue wealth. These are real things that should be pointed out and criticized. But ultimately, what comes down to it is, if we want to really solve for the problem of racial disparities in wealth and education, at this point, with the 1964 Civil Rights Act and Supreme Court precedents banning discrimination on the basis of race, we've already addressed that issue. And now we must rectify the class-based issues, which are the remnants, in many ways, of these racist policies. It's a fact. America had racist laws back in the day. We got rid of many of them. It's not perfect. We still have racists in this country. It still manifests in very awful ways. But at an institutional level, we have passed the laws banning these things. What do we do now? Well, if you take a look at people like Ibram X. Kendi, a prominent critical race theorist, he argues we must have racial discrimination. Here's what he says. They say that critical race theory promotes widespread discrimination against people of white or Asian ancestry. The most frequently cited critical race theorist, Ibram X. Kendi, makes this explicit. As he puts it, the only remedy for racial discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. The discrimination critical race theorists want to remedy, though through still more discrimination, is any failure to meet a racial quota. As Mr. Kendi puts it, quote, "When I see racial disparities, I see racism. So if a nuclear weapons lab is full of Asians and whites, not blacks, he sees it as racism, even if everybody was legally hired based solely on their qualifications, not their race. The sweeping perpetual discrimination advocated by critical race theorists violates Supreme Court decisions like Richmond v. J.A. Croson Co. 1989. Ibram X. Kendi is a particularly prominent critical race theorist. He was recently asked to define racism. He could not do it. Because critical race theorists define racism as prejudice plus power, they then use the word racism in their own definition. So that means racist structures and structures that are racist. And you're like, bro, define the word for me. You can't use the word's own definition in a definition when asked. What does anti-racist mean? It does not mean to oppose racism. No, if you oppose racism, you are opposed to racism. Anti-racism is a semantic strategy for reactionary ideologues to implement racist policy. When I covered, many of you may know this, when I covered riots in Ferguson and in Baltimore, Black Lives Matter activists were proposing segregation. They argued that we needed to return to the pre-1964 Civil Rights Act era because there was a world in which black communities were strictly for black communities. I disagree with this. I don't believe in segregation. I think people should come together and we can all hold hands and sing songs under the rainbow because we are human beings. And I don't find race to be relevant. I think it's all about the content of our characters, like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. However, people like Ibram X. Kendi believe we should discriminate on the basis of race. He calls it anti-racist discrimination. What he's saying by anti-racist is racists passed laws a long time ago. We should have those exact same laws pointed at people of different races to create the outcomes we want. As it was explained to me during Occupy Wall Street, quote, "It's our turn now." That's what they believe. All that really means is they want to return to a racially segregationist worldview or world. Sargon of Akkad, a.k.a. Carl Benjamin, who you may be familiar with, once said that the alt-right and Black Lives Matter are made for each other. They agree. They both want to separate and have their own ethno-locales or nations or whatever. White identitarians even describe much of what they want very similar to what Black Lives Matter wants. They straight up say, look at Black Lives Matter, what they're advocating for, and they'll tell you they agree with that. I've heard it from their own mouths. Go to their events. They say it. They think that they should have a right to identitarian policy just like Black Lives Matter does. I don't want any of that. I think these things are problems. I think America is built upon different people from different backgrounds with different worldviews coming together, and the best of the best create something even better. We've only had 56 years of anti-identitarian law. The 1964 Civil Rights Act was hard fought. People in my own family lived through this era and had to experience the horrors of segregation. Did you know that it was illegal to cohabitate before 1967? That's Loving v. Virginia. That means 3 years after the Civil Rights Act was passed, you as a white person still couldn't live in the same building with a Hispanic woman, with a Native American woman, with a black woman, with an Asian woman. It was illegal in many parts of this country. We fought and got rid of it. They want to bring it back. You may have seen many of the arguments from the woke that interracial dating is fetishizing, that it's wrong. And they tell people not to do it. They advocate for segregating. They say that there should be dorms specifically for certain peoples of certain races. They say that they oppose Asian hate. But then you see what happens to people like Andy Ngo. They brutally beat him. White people brutally beat him and claim that they're fighting against racism. And now they've begun to argue that whiteness is just a cultural construct and that Asians are actually now white. No joke. Meanwhile, they're arguing Slavics are not white. Okay, so explain to me how this works. There is an organization that has absolutely said that Slavic people are not white. The argument is, as I've put early on, they claim that white people have inherent privileges and certain access that regular people don't. Well, I know people who live in Ukraine. They can't come to the United States. I know people in South America and Africa who can. Where's the white privilege to help them? Well, then you start seeing there's an organization called the Coalition for Communities of Color who said that Slavic people actually are not white because whiteness is a construct of those who have power, blah, blah, blah. If that's true, then how does white privilege exist and how does passing exist? One concept that exists within critical race theory is the idea of passing. That means if you appear to be as the dominant group, you will be able to pass for them. People will believe you are them, and then you will get access to those same privileges. But Slavic people have blonde hair and blue eyes. So what is whiteness then? If you look Asian, you will pass for the white group? Why is it that they claim that it's whiteness, which is a reference to complexion, but then argue that certain racial groups are white adjacent or white when they don't have that same complexion? How can passing exist if Slavic people can also be people of color? The ideology makes no sense. It's not supposed to make sense. It's supposed to be confusing. It's supposed to advance historical revisionism. It's supposed to trick you into giving up your goodwill so that other people can steal from you, from those in the working class. It makes no sense that a homeless white person is an oppressor, but that Oprah Winfrey is oppressed. She's a billionaire. She can buy a horde of security guards to beat anybody she wants. And how would you even go after someone that powerful, even through the law? Sure, it's happened to some billionaires, but these ideas are morally bankrupt. And what it's resulting in is race-based policies that violate the law, or at least get close to it. As I mentioned, media giant iHeart says, we are looking at only diverse hires. What does that mean? It means they're not going to be hiring white people. It means they are now choosing to say, if you are white, we will not hire you. That's a violation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I don't care what your race is. I think it's wrong to segregate people. This is what they're advancing. Now, Ron Desantis and many conservatives are pushing back on this. They're getting these things banned. That's a good thing. But I want to talk about the pitfalls that conservatives are bringing up and the anti-critical race theorists are missing out on. Critical race theory is just a component of critical theory. While I showed you critical race theory and white privilege and these ideas and internalization, institutional racism, some of these things, sure, they make sense. But the authoritarian application of critical race theory is what most people are protesting against. We cannot forget it's a component of critical theory. Critical theory is an approach to social philosophy that focuses on reflective assessment and critique of society and culture in order to reveal and challenge power structures. With its origins in sociology and literary criticism, it argues that social problems are influenced and created more by societal structures and cultural assumptions than by individual and psychological factors. Maintaining that ideology is the principal obstacle to human liberation. Critical theory was established as a school of thought primarily by the Frankfurt School. Theoreticians Herbert Marcuse, Theodor Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Erich Fromm, and Max Horkheimer. Horkheimer described the theory as critical insofar as it seeks to liberate human beings from the circumstances that enslave them. In sociology and political philosophy, critical theory means Western Marxist philosophy of the Frankfurt School, developed in Germany in the 1930s and drawing on the ideas of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. So when you talk to someone, when you talk to critical race theorists and people on the left, they'll typically demand of you that you give up this information. They will say, define critical race theory. And therein lies the serious conundrum. They use definitions of words to obfuscate their true intentions. So if I just said, it's just a critical race theory is just analyzing the intersections between law and race, then it makes it sound that it's not that big a deal. I mean, well, that's normal. What if you said, I want to engage in critical lumber theory? It's where lumber and timbering policies intersects with the law. You'd be like, well, that makes sense. We want to understand why the law exists and why they ban certain timbering practices. But then what you actually tell people is that timbering is the most important thing in any component, and we should be allowed to tear down all of the trees for the sake of restoring justice. You'd be like, wait, hold on. You want to chop down all the trees? Like, we need trees. We want sustainable farming. No. We must tear all the trees down. You'd say environmentalists fought long and hard for policies to protect these trees. Your theory is not analyzing the law in timbering. It's just pretending to make an argument that we should be allowed to cut trees down in the Amazon. Hey, sound familiar? We fought long and hard for laws banning racial discrimination. These people come along and say, we're just analyzing those laws in race. and then advocating for racial discrimination, reverting us back to how things used to be. It's no surprise that it's coming from the Democratic Party. Now, I feel it's hard to break people out of the matrix. They think the Democrats are the people who oppose racism, but they've always been the party of racism. They've been the party of the South, the Dixiecrats they called them. The Democratic Party was the Confederate Party. They were the party of the Klan. They were the party of Jim Crow, and they are the party of restoring racial discrimination. It has never changed. So when someone comes to you and says, we just want to analyze the law and how it intersects, you got to ask them, do you seek to overturn the laws that protect us from racial discrimination? They'll probably still lie. No, of course not. Okay. So when iHeartMedia says they're only going to hire diverse, so we'll sue them and we'll use the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And as they pointed out in the Wall Street Journal, the sweeping perpetual discrimination advocated by critical race theorists violates Supreme Court decisions like Richmond v. J.A. Crouse & Co. When you hear that certain laboratories, nuclear laboratories, are sending white people on retreats that are overtly discriminatory, you know you're dealing with racists. When they call you into a meeting at your job or school and tell you they want to teach you the history of white people, it's overtly racist. I think we need to end discrimination on the basis of race. Unfortunately, critical race theorists are ideologues. They claim to want to oppose ideology and liberate people, but they're fascistic. Now, they're not nationalists, so I won't call them fascists, but they do believe there is no truth but power. That's critical theory. It's a dangerous line of thinking that must be opposed. We must respect individual civil liberties and rights and classical liberalism that guarantee our rights in the face of an authoritarian machine. The critical race theorists, they're the proponents of cancel culture. We must oppose them. Hopefully this has been informative and can help you, and you can share this video if people want to challenge you on what critical race theory is, but I'll leave it there. The next segment's coming up tonight at 8 p.m. over at youtube.com/TimCastIRL. Thanks for hanging out, and I will see you all then.